Now, one of the interesting things as we consider this decay and the fall of Rome in 476, and the empire has been split into two, and really we're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, that's in 476. The other part, the Eastern Empire, doesn't fall until 1453. So it goes on for another 1,000 years, the Eastern Empire. But one of the interesting things is what's going on up in France, because in France, of course, Caesar brings Gaul into the Roman Empire, and he's famous for that, and basically publicizing that with his own book, The Conquest of Gaul, which you guys are reading, and he publicizes himself, he popularizes himself. He gets 2 legions, the 10th and the 7th Legion, which are particularly loyal to him. And then, of course, he crosses the Rubicon. He forms wars against Sulla, and he's left really in control of Rome. And so we know how Caesar has managed all of these things to his advantage. Well, in Gaul, about this time, Clovis is a Frankish king, and he's known as Clovis the First. And so the Franks are a German tribe that has moved into Gaul, and he's a king of the Franks, and it's Clovis who begins the Merovingian Dynasty. Now, this is important because the Merovingian Dynasty is kind of the first semblance of order after the Roman Empire falls apart. And the dynasty is protecting people, it's putting someone on the throne. He has a son, and his son's name is Pepin. So Pepin rules another Frankish kingdom, slightly bigger, and he expands it. So Pepin is expanding the rule of the Franks. Pepin becomes famous because he rules around 714 AD. So this is, as you can tell, about 250 years after Rome falls. There's been this feudalism, and now things are kind of coming together. The Muslims are attacking Rome, or not Rome, but Europe at this point. The Muslims attack Europe. They cross into Spain from Africa, and they attack around 700 AD. It's kind of an easy date to remember. And by 714, they've overrun Spain, and the only organized resistance to the Muslim cavalry, and of course the Muslim has these terrible cavalry, that was their strength. The only organized resistance to them is the Franks. So let's make a note of that. That's important. The organized resistance to the Muslim cavalry is this Frankish army. And they have their backs to the wall. There's nobody else. There's no one else has any organization. This is a kind of a strong kingdom, and the Muslims are on the move. Okay, so Pepin has a son. Pepin's son is named Charles, and he later gets the nickname Charles Martel, which means the hammer. And Charles Martel defeats these Muslim invaders at the Battle of Tours. So maybe the most important battle fought in Europe. some historians believe it was. It was the turning point of European history. So the Muslims are stopped at the Battle of Tours, 732 AD. And their cavalry was particularly stopped by the Frankish infantry. Now, normally infantry can't stop cavalry, but they developed a pike. And these pikes, these long pointed spears, were 10 to 12 feet long. And they planted one end of the pike in the ground, the butt end, so to speak, and the sharp end they raised up out of the grass, and it impaled the Muslim horses in these big mass charges the Muslims would do to just literally run right over infantry. So it impaled the horses, and of course the horses who are charging along at about 25 miles an hour hit the pikes, they're stopped, and the rider flies right over the top of the horse. And the Franks are known for their use of the short sword. Their infantry is very, very trained using the sword. And of course these dismounted riders now who've been thrown from their horses, they're just easily defeated by the short sword. So Martel dies. Charles Martel dies in 741. This is an unwieldy instrument. 741 AD. There we go. And his son, Pepin, is very short and is known as Pepin the Short. How'd you like to be known as Willie the Short, or Chris the Short? Well, that's what he was known as, Pepin the Short. And of course, Pepin the Short's son is Charles. And this guy becomes great. This guy is one of the great names of history. Charles the Great. Charlemagne. Charles the Great. And so we have Charles the Great is a warrior king. All right, Nubbin, enough of you. Make sure this is off. Technology. I love it. Okay, over here. Cool your jets for a while. Now, some people ask, why is Charlemagne a warrior king? And it's kind of easy when you think about it. Remember now the situation in France. There are all these tribes, these groups of wandering invaders. Vikings have invaded France at the time. So there's pillaging, there's burning of villages. People come together under, and make these little forts where a local tribesman becomes like a little king, And so now these are being pulled together by Pepin and by Clovis and these Merovingians, and now Charlemagne is concerned because the Saxons, here's this big reason the Saxons are invading Gaul, or France at the time. It's not known as really France, it's today's France, but I'm not even sure what they would call it. Probably Roman Gaul is probably what they would call it, but the Saxons are invading from Germany, and so they need to defend themselves. This is really different from our experience. Our experience is we have peace and we have a very stable government, and it allows us, not allows, but our government is designed to protect our liberties, and we have inalienable rights. All of these things were not known to these people. None of these things had even crossed people's minds. Back at the time of Charlemagne, people are afraid to go outside. They are fearful of these invaders. So Charlemagne makes it his policy to take on the Saxons. And for 32 years, he fights the Saxons. He rallies these Franks, and they really beat back the Saxons from 772 to 804 AD. And you have to hand it to him. He is persistent. He's literally spent his entire reign in the saddle. I think I remember him reading that he had something like 64 individual campaigns that he personally led against the Saxons. 64! Can you believe that? Can you imagine gathering an army and going after the Saxons? 64 different campaigns. He was never at home. So in 804 AD, the Saxons finally surrender to Charlemagne, and there's peace for the first time since the Roman Empire. Can you believe that? Think about that. For the very first time since Rome's fall, they have peace. So this is law and order for the first time, and protection for people for the first time. Well, on 800 AD, Christmas Day, Charlemagne was in Rome. I'm going to put down a capital C for Charlemagne. And he was in Rome. And he's with the Pope. And there, the Pope crowns him. He's crowned by Leo III. Leo III. And he's crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, think about that for a minute. That's got to be an amazing event. That must have been quite a ceremony to be called the Holy, crowned by the Pope, nonetheless, the Holy Roman Emperor. But think about that. Think of the implications. What is that really saying? Well, number one, I think it says that the Pope is seen as above all kings in his rule. So the Pope is conveying this to Charlemagne, okay? And secondly, Charlemagne is now called upon to, and his major goal is to protect the Pope and the Pope's spiritual rule as the head of the church. And so he doesn't really like it that the Pope had the authority to crown the emperors, and but this becomes the tradition, and the Pope established Charlemagne's Empire, and this is called the Carolingian Empire. So know that what started out under Clovis as the Merovingian Empire has now been recognized by the Pope, and he says Charlemagne's Empire is the Carolingian Empire. And so he protects Rome. He sends troops out, he sends troops. So in for instance, these different groups are running about attacking Rome and attacking the territory of Italy. Charlemagne is protecting that. Charlemagne is out bringing his forces against that. So there's peace for the very first time. Now, when we think back at 410 AD, the very first barbarians who had sacked Rome, the barbarian invasion, burned and sacked Rome. Ever since then, Rome has been vulnerable. They didn't know when another invasion would come. They were vulnerable. They felt like this could happen again. Now, fast forward, it's 800. It's 400 years later, and now we have Charlemagne, who actually has this large, pretty large empire. It includes all of today's France, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, even up in northern Italy. It includes some northern Italy. And now he's the one who's going to protect Rome. So so we've had a real shift, right? Okay. Now remember, in 395 AD, the Emperor Theodosius permanently divides the empire. He does what Diocletian started, and he has concluded the empire is too big and it definitely needs two centers. So Roman Empire that started out in the west has now a western area and an eastern area. Now, remember now, this is the year Theodosius divides the empire, but remember now, all of this time, in fact, the very same year, barbarians are running around through the empire. So in 395, the Visigoths, who are one of these German tribes, actually come into the empire and they captured Athens. So Athens fell, and that same year they capture Corinth. That's great. That's where the Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians, okay? And the Vandals actually have a kingdom of northern Africa. They have swept through Spain and into North Africa, and that's where they have set up their kingdom, in North Africa. So these areas of the Roman Empire are being taken over. Incidentally, vandalism is a word that we get today from just needless destruction and violence. And the Vandals are the root of that word. This is where we get that concept. Well, in 527, of course, this is after the the Western Empire falls in Rome, the Eastern Empire has a emperor named Justinian. And Justinian, let's make sure that we know he's the empire of the Eastern Roman Empire. And Justinian does a couple amazing things that he's known for in history. In fact, today you can see him in the U.S. Capitol, in the House of Representatives. His silhouette is on one of the walls, along with other lawmakers. But number one, he pulls many laws together, and he puts them all together and codifies the law. And they call this the Codex Justinian. The Codex Justinian. And what is that? It's just assembling and putting it into a legal code, all these laws. He assembles them. Number two, very important thing about Justinian is he launches an invasion to win back Italy. And he defeats the Lombards. The Lombards are another tribe that has gotten into Italy. So let's put down Lombards. I have to put that on the next line. In fact, the Lombards take over some areas of Italy. There's an actual region today, Lombardy in Italy, that you can visit. But this is of no avail. Even though he defeats them, the tribes keep coming, and they eventually conquer northern Italy again. So even though he's kind of trying to establish the Roman Empire again, the Western Roman Empire, and he defeats the Lombards, this is still of no avail. So Rome has fallen, 476, and the world enters the Middle Ages. So with the fall, 476, this is such a big event that the Middle Ages begins. Now, as the Middle Ages begin, one of the key terms is feudalism, and it's important to understand what is a feudal lord, what is feudalism. So one author has written this. Now, the Viking storms left everyone looking for protection. The kings of the tiny little tribal nations were still too weak to field strong armies, so they could offer the people very little help. So it happened that each individual peasant had to virtually sell himself, his land, his labor, even his descendants, to anyone called the liege lord who could offer him some protection. The smaller liege lords sought the protection of the greater liege lords. They had to contribute soldiers, their peasants, to these higher liege lords. An elaborate, multi-layered system developed known as feudalism. Power was thus in the hands of a very few supreme liege lords, the nobles, who often challenged the king's authority, and the peasant masses were treated like beasts of burden. They and their children after them were tied to the land they worked. It was the same horrible system that the Roman Emperor Diocletian had inflicted on Rome. Of course, it created personal and economic disaster both times. because it violates the biblical principles of human worth, liberty, free enterprise, and private ownership of property. So I think that's a good little definition of feudalism. It's where the peasants, the common people, literally make a covenant. They covenant themselves to serve a lord, in this case known as a liege lord, and the liege lord grants protection, but can use those peasants. And so the peasants really lose control. There's a loss of the control of the land by the individual person. And I think that's an interesting statement that's made there, that because there's a loss of land ownership, you also have a violation of this principle of property. So God gives to man property, and for us to be good stewards. And now you have men that literally have to give that up. So we have a system that does help. There are some pluses about feudalism, but there are a lot of minuses as well. So we're going to read a little bit about Islam now, because Islam is another reason that feudalism springs to life and people unite around a liege lord. So Muhammad in 570 AD, a baby boy who was born. By the way, this is page 237 on your book. So in your book, page 237. A little boy was born. His name was Muhammad, and he was orphaned while very young and raised by an uncle. At an early age, he began to work in a caravan. When he was 20, he began working for a rich widow named Khadijah. 5 years later, he married her, even though she was 15 years older than he. Their marriage was a happy one, and they had 4 daughters. Muhammad often went alone to a cave where he prayed. One day, he returned from the cave and told his wife he had heard a frightening voice tell him he was to be the messenger of Allah, his name for God. Muhammad was not sure whether he should believe that voice, but his wife convinced him he was to be a very great prophet who would lead the Arabs away from the worship of idols. And so here's a section about Islam, and we're going to go ahead and give you some terms that you should be aware of for Islam and the study of the Muslims.